A severed head opened its eyes and locked onto the doctor's face. Not a reflex, full consciousness. For 30 seconds, it saw, it heard, it knew. What happened in those final moments made the doctor swear he'd never do it again. The answer will change how you think about death itself. June 28, 1905. A date that would forever change our understanding of death. Inside the courtyard of a French prison, Dr. Gabriel Beaurieux stood with a pocket watch in one hand and a notepad in the other, waiting for something no scientist had ever properly documented. The condemned man, Henri Languille, convicted of multiple counts of armed robbery and murder, was about to become the subject of an experiment that would haunt medical literature for over a century. The guillotine blade hung suspended above, 40 kilograms of steel ready to drop at terminal velocity. Beaurieux had obtained official permission from the French Ministry of Justice to do something unprecedented, to observe and record with scientific precision what happens to human consciousness in the moments immediately following decapitation. The question that had obsessed physicians, philosophers, and executioners since the guillotine's invention in 1792 was about to be answered. Does awareness survive the separation of head from body? And if so, for how long? The morning sun cast long shadows across the execution platform as Languille was led out, his hands bound behind his back. Within minutes, the blade would fall and Beaurieux would begin his observation. What he witnessed would force the medical community to confront a horrifying truth about the nature of consciousness and death. The guillotine had been designed as a humane instrument of execution, a technological marvel that promised instant, painless death. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, the physician whose name became synonymous with the device, had advocated for its use precisely because he believed it would eliminate suffering. The machine was engineered with brutal efficiency. A weighted blade angled at 45 degrees, falling from a height of over 2 meters, achieving speeds of up to 7 meters per second at impact. The entire process, from blade release to complete severance, took approximately 75 milliseconds. By comparison, a human eye blink takes 300 milliseconds. The speed was supposed to guarantee that the victim would feel nothing, that consciousness would be extinguished before pain signals could even reach the brain. But there had always been whispers, anecdotal accounts from executioners and witnesses that suggested something far more disturbing. Stories of heads that appeared to show signs of awareness after separation, eyes that moved, mouths that tried to speak. These reports were dismissed as superstition, as the imagination of traumatized observers seeing movement where there was only reflexive muscle contraction. Beaurieux, however, was not interested in folklore or speculation. He wanted empirical data, observable phenomena that could be measured and documented according to the rigorous standards of modern medical science. As Languille was positioned beneath the blade, Beaurieux moved closer to the basket that would receive the severed head, positioning himself to have an unobstructed view of the face the moment separation occurred. The executioner pulled the release lever. The blade fell with a sound like tearing fabric, and Languille's head tumbled into the wicker basket below, rolling to face upward. Beaurieux immediately noted the time, 6:43 in the morning. The experiment had begun, and what would happen in the next half-minute would provide evidence that death is not the instantaneous event we comfort ourselves believing it to be. The head lay motionless for approximately 2 seconds, the eyes half-closed, the face expressionless. Then Beaurieux did something that would echo through medical history. He called out the dead man's name, and Henri Languille's severed head responded. The eyelids lifted slowly but deliberately, and the eyes beneath them moved with purpose. This was no random spasm, no meaningless reflex. The pupils contracted against the morning light, and the eyes fixed directly on Dr. Beaurieux's face with unmistakable focus. The medical report that Beaurieux would later publish in the Archives of Anthropology of Criminology describes this moment with clinical precision. The eyelids lifted and undeniably living eyes fixed themselves on mine, with perhaps even more penetration than the eyes of people in everyday life. Think about that description for a moment. More penetration than the eyes of people in everyday life. This was not the vacant stare of a corpse. This was intentional, conscious visual tracking. The eye muscles, controlled by the 3rd, 4th, and 6th cranial nerves, executed coordinated movements to achieve binocular focus on a specific target. Beaurieux's face. The duration of this first eye contact lasted between 2 and 3 seconds, an eternity in the context of what should have been instant death. The eyes then closed again, the lids falling as if in exhaustion. But Beaurieux wasn't finished. He waited a few seconds, allowing the head to rest, and then called out again, "Languille!" Once more the eyelids parted. Slower this time, the movement requiring visible effort, as if pushing against increasing resistance. Again, the eyes focused, the pupils tracking to locate the source of the sound. Again, direct eye contact with the doctor observing him. This second response was crucial because it eliminated the possibility of coincidental muscle contraction. A reflex might occur once, triggered by the massive trauma of decapitation. But a repeated, directed response to external stimulus? That suggested something far more disturbing. Ongoing neural processing, sensory input being received and interpreted, consciousness persisting in a head separated from its body. The anatomical implications are staggering. For the eyes to focus, multiple systems must be functioning in coordination. The retina must be receiving and processing light, converting photons into electrical signals. These signals must travel along the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus and then to the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. The brain must interpret these signals, construct a visual image, and then send motor commands back through the cranial nerves to adjust the position and focus of the eyes. This is not a simple reflex arc. This is complex, integrated neural activity requiring functional cerebral cortex. Beaurieux noted that the second eye opening lasted approximately 1 to 2 seconds before the lids closed again, this time remaining shut despite his continued calls. He waited, documenting every detail, calling Languille's name a third time. Nothing. The eyelids trembled slightly, a faint flutter beneath the skin, but they did not open. Beaurieux leaned closer, observing the eyes through the partially opened lids. In his report, he wrote, "The eyes took on the glazed look which they have in the dead. The entire sequence, from the moment of decapitation to this final loss of all response, had lasted between 25 and 30 seconds. For half a minute, Henri Languille's brain had remained sufficiently functional to receive sensory input, process information, and execute voluntary motor responses." Beaurieux's conclusion, published in the archives in 1905, was unequivocal. In those, therefore, dying suddenly by decapitation, there persists for a few seconds a dreadful lucidity of mind, and it is not a reflex activity but a manifestation of the persistence of life. This was not the abstract philosophizing of previous centuries. This was empirical observation from a credentialed physician using the scientific method. And it suggested something almost too horrible to contemplate. But how is any of this biologically possible? How can a brain function without blood pressure, without oxygen supply, without any connection to the cardiovascular system? The answer lies in residual perfusion and the extraordinary efficiency of neural tissue. At the moment of decapitation, the human brain contains approximately 150 milliliters of oxygenated blood distributed throughout its vascular network. This blood is held within the carotid and vertebral arteries, the circle of Willis, and millions of smaller arterioles and capillaries that permeate brain tissue. When the head is severed, this blood doesn't instantly drain away. Surface tension and the elasticity of blood vessel walls maintain pressure temporarily, continuing to deliver oxygen to neurons for a brief but critical window. Research conducted at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, published in 2011 in the journal PLOS One, measured exactly how long mammalian brain tissue remains electrochemically active after decapitation. Using rats fitted with electroencephalogram electrodes, researchers monitored brain electrical activity following humane euthanasia by decapitation. The results were shocking. Full cortical activity persisted for an average of 17 seconds, with some subjects showing organized electrical patterns for up to 29 seconds. After this initial period, a massive wave of electrical depolarization swept across the cortex, a neurological tsunami representing the final discharge of all remaining cellular energy. The human brain is the most metabolically demanding organ in the body, consuming approximately 20% of total oxygen intake, despite representing only 2% of body mass. But this consumption is not uniform across all brain regions. The visual cortex and the brainstem nuclei that control eye movement are among the most efficient structures, capable of maintaining function on minimal oxygen supply. Studies of cerebral blood flow mapping show that the occipital cortex and the cranial nerve nuclei can operate on as little as 40% of normal oxygen levels before losing function. This efficiency is an evolutionary adaptation, ensuring that critical sensory processing continues even during moments of cardiovascular stress. In the context of a severed head, this means that vision, hearing, and the ability to process sensory information can persist even as higher cognitive functions begin to deteriorate. The pyramidal neurons in the motor cortex, which control voluntary movement, are similarly resilient. maintaining their ability to generate action potentials and transmit signals to muscles for as long as adenosine triphosphate reserves last. In practical terms, this means that for approximately 20 to 30 seconds after decapitation, the brain retains enough oxygen and glucose to support consciousness, sensory awareness, and voluntary motor control. The implications are genuinely nightmarish. Imagine the subjective experience. One moment you're standing upright, the next your entire world lurches violently downward as your head falls into a basket. Your visual field tumbles, showing you the sky. Then the blood-soaked wood of the guillotine platform. Then the wicker weave of the basket inches from your face. You try to move to right yourself, but nothing happens because you no longer have a body. No arms to push yourself up, no legs to stand on, just a head lying on its side. The proprioceptive signals that normally tell your brain where your limbs are in space are simply absent, creating a sensory void that the brain has no framework to interpret. You can still see, still hear the crowd murmuring, still feel the morning air on your face. But you cannot speak because you have no lungs to push air through your vocal cords, which themselves are now part of the body lying meters away. You try to scream and nothing emerges because the connection between intention and action has been literally severed. This is not unconsciousness. This is not the peaceful void we imagine death to be. This is full awareness trapped in a dying prison of flesh, watching the world for 30 final seconds, with no ability to interact with it. Languille's case was not an isolated incident, and Beaurieux was not the only physician to document post-decapitation consciousness. The guillotine had been in use for over a century by 1905, and its history is filled with disturbing accounts that suggest awareness after execution. On July 17, 1793, during the height of the French Revolutionary Terror, Charlotte Corday was executed for the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. After her head was severed, the executioner's assistant, a man named Legros, picked up the head by the hair and slapped it across the face in front of the assembled crowd. Eyewitness accounts, including testimony from contemporary journalist Pierre Maton de la Varenne, describe the head's reaction. The face showed unmistakable indignation, the cheeks flushed red, and the expression changed from neutral to one of obvious anger. This account has been disputed by historians who argue that the reddening was simply blood redistribution, but the specificity of multiple independent witnesses describing a change in facial expression suggests something more than passive physiological response. A muscle contraction might produce a grimace, but a coordinated shift in expression that observers interpreted as emotional response implies neural processing of the stimulus. In 1836, French physician Dr. Jean-Baptiste Vincent Laborde documented several cases of apparent consciousness in executed prisoners. In one particularly disturbing account, a decapitated head was observed attempting to bite when fingers were brought near its mouth. The jaw muscles contracted repeatedly, the teeth clacking together in what appeared to be deliberate attempts to close on the approaching fingers. Laborde conducted experiments measuring the duration of muscular response in decapitated animals, finding that voluntary muscle control persisted for significantly longer than simple reflex activity. His work differentiated between true voluntary movement and spinal reflex by noting that voluntary movements showed adaptation and response to stimulus change, while reflexes were stereotyped and unchanging. The biting attempts showed adaptation, suggesting cortical involvement. German physiologist Dr. Theodor Bischoff, in his 1880 treatise on the physiology of death, collected reports from executioners across Europe describing heads whose lips continued to move as if attempting to form words for up to 20 seconds after separation. These were not isolated twitches, but coordinated movements of the lips, tongue, and jaw muscles in patterns consistent with speech articulation, despite the physical impossibility of producing sound. Perhaps most disturbing are the accounts of executed prisoners who had arranged signals with observers beforehand, attempts to communicate from beyond the guillotine blade. In one documented case from 1793, a condemned prisoner named Prunier told his fellow inmates that he would attempt to blink his eyes repeatedly after execution if he retained consciousness. Witnesses reported that after his head fell, the eyes blinked rapidly 12 times in succession before stopping. In another case, a prisoner named Doulier agreed to try to maintain eye contact with a specific observer for as long as possible. According to the observer's written account, Doulier's severed head maintained direct eye contact for approximately 15 seconds before the eyes lost focus. These prearranged signals are particularly significant because they establish intentionality. Random muscle spasms might coincidentally resemble blinking or eye movement, but sustained, repeated actions matching a previously agreed-upon signal suggest conscious effort and awareness. The evidential value is debatable as the accounts are anecdotal and lack the rigorous documentation of Beaurieux's later experiment, but they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. What makes Beaurieux's observation uniquely valuable is its scientific rigor and reproducible methodology. Unlike anecdotal accounts from traumatized witnesses, Beaurieux was a trained physician specifically observing for signs of consciousness, using repeatable stimulus and documenting responses with precise timing. His experiment was essentially a neurological examination performed under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. By calling Languille's name, he provided an auditory stimulus that required multiple levels of neural processing to produce the observed response. Sound waves entering the ear canal must vibrate the tympanic membrane, transmit through the ossicles to the cochlea, convert to neural signals that travel via the vestibulocochlear nerve to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, where they are interpreted as meaningful sound. The brain must recognize the sound as a name, specifically the subject's own name, which requires accessing memory and self-identity. Then motor commands must be generated and transmitted through the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerves to coordinate eye opening and focusing. Each of these steps requires functional neurons, active synapses, and sufficient metabolic energy to generate action potentials. The fact that this sequence occurred twice in response to repeated stimulation is powerful evidence of ongoing cortical function. Modern neuroscience provides additional context that makes Beaurieux's observations even more significant. We now understand that consciousness is not a single unified phenomenon, but an emergent property arising from coordinated activity across multiple brain regions. The thalamus acts as a relay station, integrating sensory information and distributing it to cortical areas. The reticular activating system in the brainstem maintains arousal and wakefulness. The prefrontal cortex supports executive function and self-awareness. For consciousness to exist, these systems must be communicating through synchronized electrical oscillations, particularly in the gamma frequency range of 30 to 100 Hz. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging and electroencephalography have shown that when any of these networks becomes disconnected, consciousness fragments or disappears. Loss of blood flow to any major brain region typically results in unconsciousness within seconds. But the key word is typically. The brain has remarkable redundancy and resilience. During cardiac arrest, cerebral perfusion drops to zero, yet consciousness can persist for 10 to 20 seconds before fading, a phenomenon well documented in studies of syncope and near-death experiences. Patients who have experienced sudden cardiac arrest report continued awareness during the initial period of circulatory failure, able to hear conversations and perceive their surroundings even as they lose the ability to respond. The neurological events occurring inside a severed head would follow a predictable cascade. In the first 2 to 3 seconds, sensory systems remain fully functional. The eyes can see, the ears can hear, the nerves in the skin can feel temperature and pressure. The brain is processing this information normally, constructing a coherent picture of the environment. But simultaneously, peripheral sensors are sending alarm signals. Baroreceptors in the carotid arteries, now severed, are screaming that blood pressure has dropped to zero. Chemoreceptors are detecting rapidly rising carbon dioxide levels in the blood. The brainstem cardiovascular centers are issuing emergency commands to increase heart rate and vasoconstrict blood vessels. Commands that go nowhere because the heart and blood vessels are no longer connected to the head. During this period, awareness is probably at its peak because the stress response is flooding the brain with norepinephrine and other arousal-promoting neurotransmitters. The person is intensely, terribly conscious. Between 5 and 10 seconds, the first deficits appear. Higher cognitive functions begin to deteriorate as the prefrontal cortex with its high metabolic demands starts to fail from oxygen deprivation. Complex reasoning, planning, and abstract thought fade first. But sensory awareness and basic consciousness persist because the sensory cortices and thalamus are more resilient. By 15 to 20 seconds, the experience would begin to resemble severe hypoxia. Vision starts to narrow, peripheral areas of the visual field fading to darkness as the outer regions of the retina and visual cortex lose function. Sounds become muffled, distant. There may be a sense of floating, of detachment, similar to what pilots experience during extreme G-force when blood drains from the brain. But unlike gradual hypoxia, where unconsciousness typically precedes these symptoms, the sudden onset means awareness continues even as perception deteriorates. The person knows what is happening to them. They understand they are dying, that they have been executed, that this is the end. That metacognitive awareness, that ability to think about thinking, to know that you know, requires fairly sophisticated neural processing that can persist as long as the thalamocortical connections remain active. Studies of anoxic brain injury show that self-awareness is one of the last faculties to disappear, sometimes outlasting the ability to process external stimuli. Between 20 and 30 seconds, everything begins to shut down. The massive wave of cortical spreading depolarization sweeps across the brain, the final electrical storm as neurons discharge all their remaining energy in one catastrophic cascade. This wave, measured in animal studies, represents the point of no return, the moment when cellular energy reserves are exhausted and neurons begin to die. After 30 seconds, cellular death becomes irreversible. Even if blood flow could somehow be restored, the neurons have been without oxygen long enough that mitochondrial damage is permanent, and cell death pathways have been activated. But those 30 seconds represent a unique window where the brain is dying but not yet dead, where consciousness exists in isolation from the body that sustained it. This raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. We tend to think of awareness as dependent on a functioning body, as something that emerges from the integrated activity of the entire organism. But a severed head demonstrates that consciousness can persist, at least briefly, as a purely cranial phenomenon. The philosophical implications troubled thinkers of Beaurieux's era and continue to challenge our understanding today. If consciousness can exist independently of the body, even for 30 seconds, what does that tell us about the relationship between mind and brain? Materialist theories of consciousness hold that mental states are entirely reducible to physical brain states, but they typically assume an intact brain receiving homeostatic support from the body. A conscious severed head seems to occupy a strange liminal space, neither fully alive nor completely dead, possessing awareness but no capacity for interaction with the world. The question of pain adds another layer of horror to this scenario. Does a decapitated head feel pain? The answer is complex and depends on how we define pain. Nociception, the detection of potentially harmful stimuli by specialized nerve receptors, definitely occurs. The mechanical trauma of decapitation would trigger every pain receptor in the tissues of the neck, sending massive volleys of pain signals toward the brain. But here's where anatomy becomes crucial. The primary pain pathways from the body travel through the spinal cord, which has been completely severed. The head receives no pain signals from the body because the connection has been destroyed. However, the head itself contains pain receptors, particularly in the face, scalp, and meninges covering the brain. These receptors send signals through the trigeminal nerve directly to the brainstem, bypassing the spinal cord entirely. So while a decapitated head cannot feel pain from the neck wound itself or from the body it no longer possesses, it can potentially feel pain from trauma to the head. If the head strikes the basket hard, if it's grabbed roughly by the hair, those stimuli could register as pain. More significantly, the ischemic pain of oxygen deprivation would be intense. Anyone who has experienced the pain of a limb falling asleep and then regaining blood flow knows the burning, cramping sensation of tissue hypoxia. Imagine that sensation occurring throughout your entire brain simultaneously, every neuron screaming for oxygen it cannot receive. Modern research into the neurology of pain and consciousness has revealed additional disturbing details. A 2018 study published in the journal Neuroscience examined the temporal dynamics of pain processing during acute circulatory failure. Researchers found that the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region responsible for the affective component of pain, the part that makes pain feel bad rather than merely detectable, remains active longer during oxygen deprivation than previously thought. This region can continue to generate the subjective experience of suffering, even as other cortical areas are failing. The study concluded that during the dying process, the capacity to suffer may actually outlast the capacity to respond to or escape from painful stimuli, creating a situation where a person is locked into experiencing pain without any ability to express distress or seek relief. In the context of a severed head, this suggests that the final 30 seconds could involve intense suffering that the victim is completely unable to communicate. The only possible outlet for expressing this experience would be through facial expression and eye movement, precisely the responses that Beaurieux documented. The look of indignation on Charlotte Corday's face, the desperate blinking reported by other observers, these may have been attempts to communicate ongoing agony. The psychological terror of the experience may actually exceed the physical pain. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. Your eyes show you that you are lying in a basket detached from your body, yet your proprioceptive sense, your brain's map of where your body parts are located, still insists that you have arms and legs. This creates a profound sensory mismatch, similar to but far more extreme than phantom limb syndrome experienced by amputees. Your brain is receiving contradictory information it has no evolutionary framework to process. Humans have never evolved to handle the situation of being a conscious head separated from a body. There's no instinct, no automatic response, no psychological coping mechanism for this scenario. The result would be existential terror on a scale difficult to imagine. Studies of extreme trauma and near-death experiences consistently show that the most psychologically damaging aspect is often not the physical pain, but the loss of control, the helplessness, the awareness of one's own impending death. A person in a severed head experiences the ultimate loss of control, aware and conscious, but with absolutely no ability to affect their situation or communicate with the world. Trapped in a dying shell, watching the light fade, knowing with absolute certainty that death is seconds away, unable to scream or cry or beg for help. It is possibly the most horrific form of death imaginable. The ethical implications of Beaurieux's discovery led to significant medical and legal debates in early 20th century France. If consciousness persisted after guillotine execution, was the device truly humane? Dr. Beaurieux himself seemed deeply troubled by what he had observed. He never repeated the experiment, and in private correspondence later examined by medical historians, he wrote, "I have seen something that should never have been seen. I have proven that execution by guillotine causes suffering that cannot be expressed or measured. I cannot in good conscience inflict this knowledge on another human being by reproducing the observation." His reluctance speaks volumes about the psychological impact of witnessing conscious awareness in a severed head. Other physicians and reformers used Beaurieux's published findings to argue for abolition of capital punishment entirely, or at least for abandoning the guillotine in favor of methods that would more reliably destroy brain function instantly. The guillotine continued to be used in France until 1977, when the last execution by this method occurred. The device was officially abolished as France ended capital punishment in 1981. But the debate over consciousness and death that Beaurieux's experiment ignited continues in different forms today. Decapitation, while no longer used as judicial execution in most of the world, still occurs in several contexts that make understanding post-decapitation consciousness medically relevant. Accidental decapitation happens in industrial settings, vehicle accidents, and other traumatic scenarios. Deliberate decapitation is used in ritual execution by certain terrorist organizations and remains part of the legal code in some countries. Additionally, the question of consciousness during catastrophic brain injury has implications for emergency medicine, organ donation protocols, and determination of death. The medical definition of death has evolved significantly since Beaurieux's time. Most jurisdictions now recognize brain death, the irreversible cessation of all brain function, as legal death even if the heart continues beating with mechanical support. But brain death criteria require extensive testing to demonstrate complete loss of brainstem reflexes and cortical activity. A severed head would not meet brain death criteria for approximately 30 seconds, because it retains some brain function during that window. This creates bizarre edge cases in medical ethics and law. If someone were decapitated in an accident, and their head could theoretically be kept alive with immediate perfusion, would they be legally alive? This isn't pure speculation. Recent advances in brain preservation and the possibility of future head transplant technology make these questions increasingly relevant. In 2016, a team of neurosurgeons in China, led by Dr. Xiaoping Ren, announced plans to attempt the first human head transplant, grafting the head of a paralyzed patient onto the body of a brain-dead donor. The project was widely criticized as unethical and technically implausible, and as of 2026, no successful human head transplant has been performed. But the theoretical framework raises the same questions Beaurieux confronted. At what point does a severed head cease to be a person? If consciousness can persist for 30 seconds, could it be extended with proper oxygenation? Animal studies have shown that isolated pig brains can be kept alive and functional for up to 36 hours when connected to a specialized perfusion system, providing oxygenated blood and nutrients. The BrainX system, developed at Yale University and reported in Nature in 2019, demonstrated that cellular death is not inevitable immediately after blood flow cessation. With proper support, neural tissue can be maintained, even partially restored, hours after what would traditionally be considered death. This technology was developed for research purposes to study brain function and disease in controlled conditions, but it demonstrates that the line between life and death is not as absolute as we once believed. A severed head is not instantly dead. It is dying, a process that unfolds over approximately 30 seconds under normal conditions, but potentially extendable with intervention. The legacy of Henri Languille and Dr. Gabriel Beaurieux is a dark but important chapter in medical history. They proved with scientific rigor that death by decapitation is not instantaneous and painless, that consciousness persists in horrific isolation for half a minute. This knowledge contributed to the abolition of the guillotine and informed ongoing debates about humane execution methods, the definition of death, and the nature of consciousness itself. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the resilience and vulnerability of human consciousness. We are remarkably durable. Our brains can maintain awareness even in the most catastrophic circumstances, separated from our bodies and deprived of life support. Yet we are also fragile. That awareness is fleeting, a candle flame that gutters out in 30 seconds without the oxygen to sustain it. Languille's blinking eyes fixing on Beaurieux with intentional focus represent one of the most profound and disturbing observations in medical science. They tell us that death is not a moment, but a process, that the boundary between living and dead is a gradual transition rather than a sharp line. They remind us that suffering can persist even in circumstances where we assume it impossible. And they demonstrate that the human capacity for awareness, our consciousness that we value so highly as the essence of our humanity, can become a prison when separated from the body that sustains it. The next time you see a historical painting of a guillotine execution, or read about capital punishment debates, or contemplate the nature of death and consciousness, remember Henri Languille. Remember that for 30 terrible seconds he was just a head in a basket, aware and watching, unable to scream, counting down his final moments of existence with each diminishing heartbeat of residual blood flow through his dying brain. If this deep dive into the terrifying science of consciousness and death has shocked you, challenged what you thought you knew, or made you think differently about the nature of human awareness, hit that subscribe button. I spend weeks researching the most disturbing, fascinating intersections of history and science to bring you stories nobody else tells, with this level of detail and accuracy. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on consciousness after death, or suggest another dark corner of medical history you want me to investigate. And smash that like button if you appreciate the depth of research here. It tells me you want more content that doesn't shy away from the terrifying truths that most educational channels won't touch. Your support keeps these deep investigations coming.